The grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel glimmered with wealth and elegance. Crystal chandeliers hung low, casting a golden light on the polished marble floors. Waiters in sharp tuxedos glided through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne flutes that sparkled like stars. The air hummed with muted conversations, clinking glasses, and the faint strains of a live orchestra playing a melancholic waltz. It was the charity gala of the season, and every influential name in the city was in attendance. Victor Greaves, dressed in a custom-tailored black suit that cost more than most people's yearly salaries, leaned against the bar with a drink in hand. His sharp, chiseled features looked bored, his piercing blue eyes scanning the room with disinterest. He wasn't here for the cause, he rarely cared about such things. This was just another obligatory appearance to maintain his image, to keep whispers of his ruthlessness from becoming too loud. And then he saw her. She was a vision of grace, moving through the crowd with the poise of royalty. Cassandra Rose, a name he recognized only vaguely, though he couldn't remember where he'd heard it. She was draped in a figure-hugging black silk gown that shimmered subtly under the lights, her dark hair swept into an elegant updo. A strand of pearls adorned her neck, and her emerald green eyes glinted with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the facade of the gala's glittering veneer. Victor watched her for a moment, his curiosity piqued. She didn't seem like the other women in attendance, who fluttered from one powerful man to another, hoping to secure a moment of attention. Cassandra stood apart, as though she existed in her own sphere, untouchable yet inviting. With a sip of his drink, Victor decided he had to meet her. "Excuse me," he said, stepping into her path just as she turned toward the bar. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Victor Greaves." Cassandra paused, her lips curving into a soft, enigmatic smile. "Cassandra Rose," she replied, her voice low and smooth, like the hum of a cello. "I know who you are, Mr. Greaves. It's hard not to in this city." Victor's brow lifted, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "And yet, I can't say the same about you. That's rare." "I prefer to keep it that way," she said, her smile deepening slightly. "The spotlight isn't always kind." Intrigued, Victor gestured to the bar. "May I buy you a drink? Or is that too much of a cliché for a gala like this?" She tilted her head, considering him for a moment. Then, with an almost imperceptible shrug, she said, "Why not? A glass of red, please." Victor signaled the bartender and ordered her drink. As they waited, he studied her more closely. Up close, Cassandra was even more striking. Her beauty wasn't just in her features, it was in the way she carried herself, a mix of strength and vulnerability that was impossible to ignore. "Forgive me for prying," Victor began, handing her the glass of wine, "but you don't seem like the typical gala attendee. What brings you here?" Cassandra's smile faltered for a brief moment, replaced by a flicker of sadness. "Obligation," she said, echoing his earlier thoughts, though she couldn't have known them. "My late husband was a big supporter of this cause. I suppose I'm here to honor his memory." Victor's smirk faded, replaced by a look of feigned sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said simply, taking a sip of her wine. Her tone was polite but detached, as though she had heard those words far too often in the past 6 months. "May I ask what happened?" Victor ventured, his curiosity now genuine. Cassandra hesitated, her emerald eyes dropping to the glass in her hand. For a moment, Victor thought she might brush him off, but then she looked up, her gaze steady and unflinching. "It was sudden," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "A heart attack. He was only 45. One moment, he was here, full of life, and the next, she trailed off, letting the unfinished sentence hang in the air." Victor nodded, his expression somber. "That's tragic. He must have meant a great deal to you." "He did," she said softly. "He wasn't perfect, but he was a good man. He believed in hard work, in giving back. Sometimes I wonder if he gave too much, if it cost him more than he could afford." Victor took a sip of his drink, his mind racing. He had heard of Cassandra's late husband now that she mentioned him. Richard Rose, the real estate mogul who had made a name for himself by revitalizing blighted neighborhoods. Victor hadn't thought much of him at the time, dismissing him as one of those sentimental types who prioritized legacy over profit. Now, standing before the widow he had left behind, he felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Cassandra must have sensed a shift in mood, because she changed the subject. "And you, Mr. Greaves? What brings you here? Surely you don't strike me as the type to attend charity galas for fun." Victor chuckled, the tension breaking slightly. "You're very perceptive. Let's just say it's good for business to be seen at these things." She arched an elegant brow. "Honest, if not exactly noble." "I've never claimed to be noble," he replied, his smirk returning. "I leave that to people like your late husband." For the first time that evening, Cassandra laughed, a soft, melodic sound that sent a shiver down Victor's spine. "At least you're honest about it. Most people would try to pretend otherwise." "I don't see the point in pretending," Victor said, leaning slightly closer. "I prefer to focus on what's real. And you, Mrs. Rose, strike me as someone very real." Cassandra's smile didn't waver, but her eyes darkened, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. "That's quite a line, Mr. Greaves. Do you use it often?" "Only when it's true," he said, his voice dropping to a lower, more intimate tone. The air between them seemed to shift, charged with an electricity that neither could deny. Cassandra's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she took another sip of her wine, breaking the tension. The orchestra struck up a new tune, a slow, haunting melody that seemed to wrap around them like a spell. Victor extended his hand. "Dance with me." Cassandra hesitated, her eyes searching his for a reason to say no. Finding none, she placed her hand in his. "Just one," she said, her voice soft but firm. Victor led her to the dance floor, where the other couples seemed to part like the Red Sea, giving them space. He placed a hand on her waist, his touch light but firm, and she rested her hand on his shoulder. Their movements were smooth and synchronized, as though they had been dancing together for years. "You're good at this," Cassandra said, a note of surprise in her voice. Victor smirked. "You don't become a billionaire without learning a few tricks." She rolled her eyes, but couldn't suppress a smile. "Of course. The billionaire card." As they moved across the floor, Victor felt a strange sense of ease. He had danced with countless women, but none had ever made him feel quite like this. Cassandra wasn't trying to impress him, wasn't fawning over his wealth or power. She was simply herself. The song ended, and they stopped, still holding each other's gaze. The room around them seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them in the golden glow of the chandeliers. "Thank you for the dance," Cassandra said, stepping back. "Thank you for saying yes," Victor replied. As they returned to the bar, the night took on a dreamlike quality. They talked for hours, their conversation weaving between light banter and deeply personal confessions. By the time the gala began to wind down, Victor knew he couldn't let her slip away. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and urgent. Cassandra hesitated, her eyes searching his. Then, with a small, enigmatic smile, she said, "Lead the way." And just like that, Victor Greaves and Cassandra Rose left the gala together, the spark between them ready to ignite into a blaze that would change both their lives forever. Victor leaned against the balcony railing of his sprawling penthouse, a glass of whiskey in hand. The lights of the city twinkled below, but his focus was on the woman inside. Cassandra stood by the fireplace, her silhouette illuminated by the flickering flames. She moved with the grace of a dancer, her dark curls cascading over her shoulders as she sipped from her wineglass. She exuded confidence, a mixture of mystery and allure that had drawn him in from the moment they met. Victor smirked, savoring his drink. To him, she was just another trophy, another woman who couldn't resist his charm and power. He thrived on the thrill of the chase, the satisfaction of winning. Yet, Cassandra was different. She hadn't melted under his advances like the others. She had challenged him, played his game with a skill that left him intrigued. "You've been staring at me for 5 minutes, Victor," Cassandra's voice broke the silence, smooth and laced with amusement. She turned to face him, her piercing eyes meeting his. Do I amuse you that much? Victor chuckled, stepping inside. I find you fascinating, he replied, setting his glass on the table. You're not like the others. She raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a sly smile. The others? Do tell, Victor. How many others have there been? He laughed, brushing her question aside. Enough to know you're unique, he said, his voice lowering as he closed the distance between them. You have a way of keeping me on my toes. Cassandra tilted her head, her smile widening. Is that why you invited me here? To be entertained? Victor reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. No, Cassandra. I invited you here because I wanted you. And I always get what I want. Her eyes darkened, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in closer, her lips brushing against his ear as she whispered, Be careful, Victor. Sometimes what you want comes at a price. Victor froze for a moment, caught off guard by the edge in her tone. But then her lips captured his, and all thoughts of caution evaporated. Their kiss was electric, filled with a hunger that bordered on violence. They stumbled toward the couch, their bodies tangling as they gave in to the fiery chemistry between them. The next morning, Victor woke to find Cassandra draped across the bed, her bare back exposed to the soft morning light. She looked serene, her beauty almost disarming. For a moment, he allowed himself to marvel at her, at the way she had consumed his thoughts. But he quickly pushed the sentiment aside. He was Victor, after all, a man who didn't get attached. As if sensing his gaze, Cassandra stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She smiled lazily, propping herself up on one elbow. Good morning, she said, her voice husky from sleep. Victor smirked, pulling on his robe. Good morning. Sleep well? Like a baby, she replied, stretching languidly. You have a way of exhausting a woman, Victor. He chuckled, pouring 2 cups of coffee and handing one to her. I aim to please. They sipped their coffee in comfortable silence until Cassandra spoke again. So, Victor, what's the plan for today? Another high-stakes business meeting? Another empire to conquer? Victor's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Something like that. Why? Are you interested in joining me? Cassandra set her cup down, her expression thoughtful. Maybe. You intrigue me, Victor. I want to know what makes you tick. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. And what do you think you'll find? Cassandra smiled, leaning closer. A man who's used to winning. A man who doesn't care who he steps on to get to the top. Her words hung in the air, their weight unmistakable. For a brief moment, Victor felt a flicker of unease, but he brushed it aside. He was Victor, unstoppable, untouchable. No one could outplay him, not even Cassandra. You're not wrong, he said, his voice steady. But it's all part of the game, isn't it? Cassandra's smile widened, but there was something cold in her eyes. Oh, Victor. You have no idea how much I love a good game. Days turned into weeks, and Victor found himself falling deeper under Cassandra's spell. She was intoxicating, a whirlwind of passion and intrigue. Their nights were wild, almost feral, filled with a heat that left him breathless. During the day, she pushed him to think bigger, to dream grander. Together, they plotted ventures that promised to make him even more powerful. But there was a side to Cassandra that kept him guessing. She was fiercely independent, never letting him feel like he had complete control. She would disappear for hours without explanation, only to return with a knowing smile that left him burning with curiosity. One evening, as they shared a bottle of wine on the terrace, Cassandra brought up her late husband. His name was Richard, she said softly, her gaze distant. He was a good man. Honest, hard-working. But he made one mistake, he trusted the wrong people. Victor shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight of her words. What happened to him, he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Cassandra's eyes hardened, her jaw tightening. He lost everything. His company, his reputation, his dignity. Someone orchestrated a hostile takeover, left him with nothing. He couldn't handle it. In the end, she paused, her voice trembling. He took his own life. Victor's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't need her to say it, he already knew he was the someone she spoke of. But he masked his guilt with a neutral expression, reaching out to take her hand. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "That must have been devastating." Cassandra's gaze met his, and for a moment, he saw something raw and unguarded in her eyes. But then she smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a chill down his spine. "It was," she said simply. "But I've learned to live with it." Victor nodded, though uneasy gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that Cassandra knew more than she let on, that she was playing a game far more dangerous than he had anticipated. But he pushed the thought aside. After all, he was Victor, the one who always came out on top. That night, as Cassandra lay asleep beside him, Victor stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He thought about Richard, about the deal that had ruined him. At the time, it had seemed like just another victory, another step toward greatness. But now, with Cassandra in his life, the consequences felt heavier. He glanced at her, her face serene in the moonlight. She was beautiful, powerful, and unpredictable. And for the first time in his life, Victor felt a flicker of doubt. Had he underestimated her? Was he the one being played? Cassandra stirred, her eyes opening to meet his. She smiled sleepily, reaching out to touch his face. "Can't sleep?" she murmured. Victor forced a smile, shaking his head. "Just thinking." "About what?" she asked, her fingers tracing lazy circles on his chest. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Business." Cassandra's smile widened, but there was a glint in her eyes that made his chest tighten. "Careful, Victor," she said softly. "Thinking too much can be dangerous." Victor laughed, though the sound felt hollow. "And why is that?" Cassandra leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear. "Because the more you think, the more you realize how little you control." Her words sent a shiver down his spine, but before he could respond, she kissed him, silencing any protest. Victor closed his eyes, surrendering to the moment, but the unease lingered. He was Victor, the man who controlled everything. And yet, with Cassandra, he felt like a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. As the night stretched on, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that his world was unraveling, one calculated move at a time. And at the center of it all was Cassandra, a woman who had turned his life into a seductive, dangerous dance of passion and revenge. Victor leaned back in his leather chair, the gleam of greed lighting up his face as Cassandra laid out her latest idea. She stood across from him, poised and confident, her red lips curling into a smile that hinted at both charm and danger. "It's simple, Victor," she said, sliding a glossy folder across his desk. "The offshore development deal will open doors to markets you've never tapped into before. We're talking billions. Not millions, billions." Victor's fingers drummed on the folder as he opened it, scanning the detailed documents inside. Every chart, every figure looked perfect. Too perfect, some might say, but Victor's hunger for more drowned out any whispers of doubt. "And these investors?" he asked, looking up at her. "You're sure they're legitimate?" Cassandra tilted her head, feigning offense. "Do you think I'd bring you something that wasn't?" "Victor, you know me better than that. These are seasoned players, people who want discretion as much as you do. Offshore deals like this don't happen with amateurs." Victor smirked, leaning forward. "You have a way of making everything sound so convincing, Cassandra. It's almost dangerous." Her laughter rang out, soft and melodic. "Dangerous? Only to those who can't keep up. But you're Victor, untouchable, right?" The compliment stroked his ego, and he couldn't help but laugh. "Exactly. That's why this deal is going to be the crown jewel of my empire." Cassandra leaned closer, her tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Then we need to move fast. The window of opportunity won't stay open forever." I've already spoken to the investors, they're ready to move, but they need to see your commitment. Victor's brow furrowed slightly. How much are we talking? 10 million up front, she said smoothly, not missing a beat. Just to secure your position. The rest will follow as the project takes off. Victor paused, studying her face. There was something intoxicating about the way she spoke, the confidence with which she delivered every word. He wanted to trust her, even though his instincts whispered caution. You really think this will work? He asked, testing her resolve. Cassandra placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch both reassuring and electrifying. Victor, this isn't just a deal, it's your legacy. Do you really want to pass up a chance to solidify your name as the greatest? Or will you let doubt hold you back? Her words were like fuel to his ambition. He nodded, his decision made. Let's do it. Weeks later, as millions flowed into the project, Victor's paranoia began to fester. Late at night, he would sit in his study, sipping whiskey and staring at the deal's documents. Something about them gnawed at him, but he couldn't pinpoint what. Cassandra, meanwhile, remained unbothered, her presence both soothing and unsettling. One evening, he finally voiced his suspicions. You know too much, Cassandra, he said, his voice low. About my deals, my past. Sometimes I wonder if I've made a mistake trusting you. Cassandra met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Trusting me is the best decision you've ever made, Victor, she said softly, a shadow of a smile playing on her lips. Because without me, you'd have nothing. The thunder roared outside Victor's mansion, the storm casting eerie shadows across the grand estate. Victor sat in his study, sipping whiskey as he pored over documents from the offshore deal. His nerves were frayed, his gut gnawed by a growing unease. Yet, he dismissed the feeling as paranoia, a side effect of the high-stakes game he had always played. Suddenly, the sound of shattering glass jolted him. He froze, the tumbler of whiskey slipping from his fingers and crashing to the floor. Voices echoed through the hallways, followed by the unmistakable thud of boots. What the hell? Victor muttered, rising to his feet. He barely had time to react before his study door burst open, revealing federal agents armed with rifles and determination. Victor Montague, one agent barked, stepping forward. You're under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Victor's mind raced. There must be some mistake, he shouted, his voice thick with desperation. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The agent ignored him, snapping the cuffs onto Victor's wrists. We know exactly who we're dealing with. We have all the evidence we need. As the agents began ransacking his study, Victor's chest tightened. Evidence? What evidence? He demanded, struggling against their grip. One of the agents turned, holding up a thick file filled with damning documents. Your offshore scheme, your role in the hostile takeover that drove Richard Carlyle to suicide, all of it. You've been played, Mr. Montague. Victor's breath hitched at the mention of Richard Carlyle. His blood ran cold as realization dawned. Cassandra. No, he whispered, his knees threatening to buckle. She wouldn't. The agents dragged him out of the room, his protests drowned by the chaos. As they led him down the grand staircase, Victor's eyes darted around, searching for her. And then he saw her. Cassandra stood in the shadows near the doorway, her face calm, her posture unbothered. Her lips curled into a cold, calculating smile as their eyes met. Victor's heart clenched, rage and betrayal surging through him. You, he spat, his voice breaking. It was you all along. Cassandra stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She stopped just out of reach, her expression unreadable. I told you, Victor, she said softly, her voice cutting through the noise. Sometimes what you want comes at a price. Victor lunged forward, but the agents held him back. You set me up, he roared. You used me. After everything I did for you, everything we had. Cassandra tilted her head, her smile widening. Everything we had? Oh, Victor, you don't get it, do you? This was never about us. This was about Richard. About justice. Her words were a dagger to his chest, but the final blow came when she pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. A video began to play, the unmistakable sound of Victor's voice confessing his role in Richard's downfall during one of their arguments. "You're a monster," the recorded Victor sneered. "Your husband was weak, and I crushed him because I could." The agents stopped in their tracks, listening as the recording played out. Victor's face turned pale, his strength draining from him. "You recorded me?" he croaked, disbelief etched on his face. Cassandra slipped the phone back into her pocket, her expression triumphant. "Consider it a memento of our time together," she said, her tone icy. "Goodbye, Victor." As the agents hauled him into the stormy night, Victor's screams echoed through the rain, his empire crumbling around him. And in the shadows of the doorway, Cassandra watched, her mission complete, her vengeance fulfilled. The news hit like a thunderclap: Victor Montague, the once untouchable business mogul, had fallen. Headlines splashed across every major outlet: Empire of Greed crumbles, Montague assets frozen amid scandal, and Victor Montague, from tycoon to pariah. Victor sat in his prison cell, staring at the cracked concrete walls. His suit, once a symbol of power, had been replaced with a dull orange jumpsuit. His hands trembled as he ran them through his graying hair. The phone calls he had desperately made to his most trusted allies had gone unanswered. Every connection, every handshake he had once relied on, was severed. They had abandoned him the moment the scandal broke. "Visitor for you," a guard barked, jolting Victor from his thoughts. He rose slowly, his movements heavy with defeat. When he entered the visitor's room, he froze. It wasn't a lawyer or a former associate. It was Cassandra. She sat confidently, her polished demeanor untouched by the storm she had unleashed. She wore a sleek black dress and a faint smile, her presence radiating power. "Cassandra," Victor said hoarsely, his voice cracking. "Why are you here? To gloat?" She leaned back in her chair, her eyes sharp as daggers. "No, Victor. I came to remind you of what happens when you underestimate the wrong person." Victor clenched his fists, his face twisted with anger and regret. "You planned all of this from the start, didn't you?" Cassandra tilted her head, her expression unapologetic. "I did. You destroyed Richard's life, Victor. You didn't just take his company, you took his dignity, his will to live. Did you really think I'd let that go?" He slammed his hand on the table, the chains on his wrist clinking. "You've ruined me. You destroyed everything I built." Cassandra's smile widened, but her eyes remained cold. "No, Victor. You destroyed yourself. I just gave you the push you deserved." Victor stared at her, his chest heaving with a mix of fury and despair. "You think you've won, don't you?" "I don't think," she said calmly. "I know." Outside the courtroom, the media swarmed as Cassandra emerged victorious from her lawsuit against Victor's estate. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust in her direction. Her calm, poised demeanor captivated the public. "Mrs. Carlyle," a reporter called out, "how do you feel about reclaiming your late husband's legacy?" Cassandra stopped, her smile warm but calculated. "This isn't about me," she said smoothly. "It's about justice. Richard's dreams were stolen, and today, I've ensured they can live on." Cheers erupted from the crowd, but behind the applause were whispers. Some questioned how she had orchestrated such a meticulous downfall, hinting at the ruthlessness behind her rise. Victor, now a shadow of the man he once was, watched the news from his cell. His name was now synonymous with disgrace, while Cassandra was heralded as a symbol of resilience. In his heart, he knew, she had not only defeated him but had ensured his legacy would be one of failure. And she had done it with the same precision and ruthlessness he once prided himself on.